And Clark does not come near her body. She blocked that shot. Should have been a shot block. Look at this. And we had a close game at the end of the third. That's all ball. That's all ball. And then look at this one. We had to use a...
There are games that end on a buzzer and games that end on a controversy. And then there are games where you watch the final minutes play out and genuinely cannot tell which one you just witnessed. This was one of those. By the time the clock hit 0, social media had already made up its mind. Clips were flying, screenshots were stacking up, fans from both sides were pointing at the same footage and somehow seeing two completely different things. And at the center of all of it, a sequence of officiating decisions so disputed, so visually confusing, that they turned a national argument about bias, accountability, and what the league actually owes its growing audience. We're going to break this down possession by possession, not to push a narrative, not to declare a winner, but because the footage deserves honest analysis, and because the questions it raises are legitimate ones, even if some of the commentary surrounding it went places it never should have gone. If you've already seen the clips and already formed your opinion, stay with us, because some of what we found is going to complicate whatever side you're currently on. The sequence that detonated everything came late. A travel called on Aaliyah Boston, a high-leverage, close game, the kind of moment where every possession is essentially a coin flip for momentum, and the wrong call doesn't just cost 2 points, it can cost the entire contest. And when fans watched the replay, they weren't just frustrated about one whistle, they were furious because that call didn't exist in isolation. It was the last entry in a list of disputed decisions that had been building all game long, and by the time Boston was whistled, a significant portion of the viewing audience had already lost confidence in the crew working the floor. That is the most important thing to understand before we get into any individual play. When fans accuse officials of bias or inconsistency, they're rarely reacting to a single moment. They're reacting to accumulation. One questionable call is human error. 2 starts a pattern. By the time you reach the 5th or 6th disputed whistle, the audience isn't watching basketball anymore. They're watching for confirmation of something they've already decided. And that's a problem the WNBA created by not addressing the earlier calls with enough clarity. Now, travel rulings are genuinely tricky to evaluate because most fans and most officials are applying slightly different standards. The gather step, the moment a player establishes control of the ball, determines when the step count actually begins. What looks like 3 clear steps in slow motion may technically be legal depending on when control is established. Officials are trained to identify the gather. Fans usually start counting the moment the ball touches the hand. Those 2 starting points can produce wildly different conclusions from the exact same footage. So when Boston was called, the question wasn't simply, did she travel? The question was the same standard being applied to every other player in that building that night? And the answer to that question is where things get genuinely difficult to defend. But the Boston call was only the final chapter. To understand why this game broke the internet, you have to go back to what happened before it. Caitlin Clark put her hand toward the basketball, the shot went up, the whistle blew, and from the angle that millions of people watched, she didn't come near the shooter's body. No hip contact, no shoulder, no arm across the chest. The hand went toward the ball, and from what the replay showed, the ball was exactly where her hand went. That should be a block, clean, legal, textbook defense. Now, here's the part that makes this genuinely complicated rather than simply outrageous. Broadcasting a game means you're showing 1 or 2 angles at any given time. A different camera from a different position could technically reveal contact that the available replay concealed. Officials aren't wrong to consider that. They're positioned on the floor specifically to see things that broadcast cameras don't always capture. So the call being visually confusing on the replay does not automatically mean the referee was wrong. But here's where that argument runs out of runway. When the replay that's available to millions of people looks clean, not borderline, not ambiguous, but genuinely clean, and a foul is still on the board, the league has to expect the criticism that follows. You can't ask fans to trust a standard they can't see being applied, and the officiating crew cannot act surprised when the audience rejects a call that the replay appears to contradict.
The more damaging consequence isn't even the 2 free throws. It's what the foul call does to Clark as a defender going forward. She's already been criticized regularly for her defensive limitations. Analysts point to her struggles containing quicker guards, reaching too often into driving lanes, getting beaten at the point of attack. Those are fair basketball conversations. But when she makes what appears to be a clean block and still gets penalized for it, she's now in an impossible position. She's told to defend more aggressively, she tries, and then she's apparently punished for it anyway. The rational response is to pull back, stop contesting as hard, stop challenging shots near the arc, and the moment a defender starts second-guessing herself, the offense has already won something that never showed up in the box score. That's the hidden cost of a questionable whistle. It doesn't just affect the possession it's called on, it ripples forward through every defensive decision that player makes for the rest of the night. The call was overturned on challenge. The system worked. That's the defense you hear most often in these situations, and it's technically accurate in the narrowest possible sense. The wrong call was identified, the correct ruling was applied, and the game moved on. So what's the problem? The problem is what it cost to get there. Every team in the WNBA enters a game with a limited number of challenges. Those challenges aren't just administrative tools, they're strategic weapons. A coaching staff might spend an entire timeout session deciding when to deploy one. Do you use it early when the error is obvious, or do you hold it for the final minute when the stakes are life and death? Using a challenge is never free, even when the challenge succeeds. Even when you're right, you spent something. And depending on the league's rules about successful challenges and whether you get your review back, you may have just gambled your ability to contest a different call later, potentially a more important one. Here's the part that deserves to be said plainly. Correcting a mistake after the fact doesn't undo the fact that the mistake was made. The whistle still interrupted momentum. Both teams still got an unscheduled stoppage. The coaching staff still had to make a real-time decision about burning a review on something that shouldn't have been called in the first place. The outcome was corrected. The process was not clean, and those are two different things. The challenge system exists precisely for moments like this, but it was designed as a safety net, not a substitute for getting the call right on the floor. When officials make errors obvious enough that challenges are required to fix them, they've already created damage that the review process can't fully repair. And Indiana was now carrying forward a game with one fewer challenge available, a detail that could become decisive in the final minutes. As it turned out, the final minutes had a lot more to offer in terms of controversy. This is the comparison that makes everything before it harder to explain away. Caitlin Clark gets whistled for defensive contact. The play appears clean on replay. Meanwhile, a few possessions later, Kelsey Mitchell goes up for a shot, airborne, fully committed, impossible to protect herself, and absorbs contact that appears significant enough to be a foul, and no whistle comes. Take those two plays together, and the consistency argument doesn't just have legs anymore, it has a foundation. Airborne players occupy a special category in basketball because they're uniquely vulnerable. Once your feet leave the floor, you cannot change direction. You cannot absorb a hit the way you can when you're planted. You cannot protect yourself. This is exactly why the rules place defenders under extra obligation when a player is in the air. You cannot enter their landing space, you cannot displace their body, and illegal arm contact during the shooting motion is generally called even when it's not dramatic. That's not a preference, that's the rule as it's written. Now, not every collision in mid-air is automatically a foul. Offensive players can initiate contact, defenders can establish legal position before the shot. Incidental contact exists and is occasionally appropriate to let play through. These are real considerations, but the threshold for calling a foul on an airborne shooter is not high. Significant body movement during the shooting motion is usually enough, and when the footage shows what appears to be meaningful contact and the whistle stays quiet, the audience isn't being unreasonable when it asks why. Placed back-to-back, Clark called for defense that looks clean, Mitchell unprotected on offense despite visible contact. This becomes the single hardest moment for anyone defending the officiating to address. It's not about which team you support, it's about whether the same standard was being enforced at both ends of the floor. And based on what's visible in the available footage, the answer to that question is difficult to frame as a yes.
This is the comparison that turns casual skepticism into a genuine credibility issue. not because it proves coordination or intent, but because it shows that similar forms of contact received opposite treatment within the same game, on the same night, from the same crew. That is the definition of inconsistency. And inconsistency at that level is not easily explained away as human error when it appears to systematically disadvantage one team. Star treatment is one of the oldest debates in professional sports, and it never gets resolved because both versions of the complaint are simultaneously plausible. Some fans believe established stars receive favorable treatment because the league benefits commercially when its biggest names succeed. More free throws, more protection, less physical punishment than lesser-known players. Other fans believe certain stars are actually officiated more harshly because referees want to prove they aren't being swayed by reputation, so they overcompensate in the other direction. Caitlin Clark has somehow managed to become the central figure in both arguments at the exact same time. Her supporters say defenders are permitted to play with excessive physicality against her. Contact that would draw a whistle if applied to most other guards gets swallowed when she's the one on the receiving end. Her critics say she draws attention and calls that other players in the same position wouldn't receive. These two claims logically cannot both be fully true, but they're both being made with complete sincerity by people watching the same games. The only productive way through that contradiction is comparison. Not anecdote, not vibes, not which fan base is louder online. Actual possession-by-possession comparison. Was the defender vertical? Was there meaningful arm contact? Did the offensive player initiate the collision? Was the shooter displaced from her natural landing space? Was the same action called at the other end of the floor? That last question is the one that matters most, and it's the one this game failed to answer satisfactorily. Consistency in officiating does not mean every game is called perfectly. It means comparable actions receive comparable rulings within the same contest. Players are remarkably adaptable. A guard can adjust to a tight whistle if it's applied equally. She can adjust to a physical game if the physicality goes both ways. What she cannot adjust to is a standard that shifts from possession to possession with no visible logic. Once that uncertainty sets in, it changes how every player on the floor approaches contact. Defenders stop challenging because they don't know what's legal anymore. Offensive players start selling contact they might have previously absorbed. The game gets worse for everyone, and the officials, not the players, created that environment. Let's be direct about this part because it matters more than it might seem in the moment. At a certain point in the original commentary, the argument stopped being about basketball. Suggestions were made that LGBTQ individuals shouldn't be allowed to officiate in the WNBA. A coach's shirt supporting trans kids was cited as evidence of something sinister, and that's where a legitimate sports grievance got weaponized into something genuinely harmful, and, more practically, something that completely undermined the basketball argument being made. Here's why this matters beyond the obvious. An official's sexual orientation or gender identity has nothing to do with whether they can accurately identify a travel, properly position themselves on a block charge play, or consistently apply a foul standard to two different players. Nothing. Criticizing the positioning on that Mitchell non-call is legitimate. Criticizing the angle the official chose on the Clark block is legitimate. Criticizing the mechanics of the review process is legitimate. All of that belongs in the conversation. Suggesting that LGBTQ people should be categorically disqualified from working WNBA games is discriminatory, full stop. And beyond being wrong on its own terms, it's also strategically catastrophic for anyone actually trying to hold the league accountable for bad officiating. Because the moment that comment enters the record, defenders of the officiating no longer have to answer the basketball questions. They can point to the discriminatory framing and dismiss the entire complaint as motivated by bigotry rather than legitimate grievance. The offensive statement becomes the story. The Mitchell non-call gets buried underneath it. A coach wearing a shirt expressing a social or political belief is also not evidence of a coordinated effort to target specific players. A shirt is a shirt. To connect that garment to specific foul calls on specific possessions, you would need something far more substantial than the shirt existing and the calls being disputed. Credible evidence of coordination does not look like that. And in the absence of credible evidence, that connection cannot be responsibly made.
The basketball argument in this game is actually strong. The Mitchell comparison alone is genuinely hard to dismiss when you place it next to the Clark call. That argument doesn't need discrimination attached to it. In fact, discrimination attached to it makes it weaker, not stronger. The cleanest version of this complaint is the one that never went there. While all of this was unfolding on the court, a different kind of comparison was being made on the sideline. Olivia Miles expressing frustration toward a referee was flagged as an example of behavior that would draw intense public condemnation if it were Clark doing the exact same thing. And there is something real in that observation, even if the framing around it got complicated. Identical behavior genuinely can be received differently depending on who's performing it. One player gets called passionate, another gets called disrespectful. One athlete's competitiveness is praised, another's is described as a character problem. These perceptions are not always fair, and they're often shaped by factors that have nothing to do with the actual behavior: reputation, media attention, who the cameras choose to follow, what narrative has already been built around a player before she even steps onto the court. Caitlin Clark exists in a media environment unlike any other player in the WNBA. Cameras follow her constantly. Every reaction she has, to a bad call, to a missed shot, to contact she disagrees with, is captured, slowed down, replayed, and dropped into feeds where people who have already formed strong opinions about her are waiting to respond. Miles doesn't operate in that same environment. That doesn't mean Miles gets away with more because of favoritism. It may simply mean that her reactions aren't being cataloged and broadcast at the same volume. That asymmetry in coverage creates asymmetry in perception, and the league's media partners deserve some accountability for that. But the technical foul standard itself has to be conduct-based, regardless of who the player is. The relevant questions are specific and they're not complicated. Did the player use prohibited language toward an official? Did she continue after being told to stop? Did she physically approach the official in a threatening or intimidating way? Those are the benchmarks. If Miles met none of those thresholds, she shouldn't be penalized. If Clark meets none of those thresholds in a similar situation, she shouldn't be penalized either. And if one player regularly faces consequences while the other doesn't for objectively comparable behavior, that's a real problem worth documenting, with actual evidence, not impressions shaped by which players the broadcast decides to linger on. Calling any athlete a horrible person for arguing a foul call is excessive. Arguing calls is part of competitive basketball, always has been. The line that matters isn't whether a player expresses emotion, it's whether that expression crosses into conduct that can be defined objectively and enforced consistently. When leagues lose track of that distinction, they don't just create controversy around individual calls, they create an atmosphere where players don't trust the rules they're playing under. And then, the game came down to Aaliyah Boston. By the time that travel was called, the audience watching wasn't evaluating it as an isolated play. They couldn't. Every previous disputed call had been filed away, and the Boston whistle arrived in a context already heavy with accumulated grievance. That's the cruelest thing about late-game officiation in a contested game. The final call doesn't get judged on its own merits anymore. It gets judged against everything that preceded it. And when everything that preceded it was already in question, the final call becomes a symbol for the whole night rather than just one more possession. Was the travel correct? That depends on the gather, as we've already established. Depending on when Boston established control of the ball, what looked like an extra step may or may not have been legal under the precise interpretation of the rule. These are genuine gray areas. The problem isn't necessarily that the call was made. The problem is that calls of this type have to be applied with rigid consistency throughout the game. And by the time Boston was whistled, too many fans had already formed the impression that the consistency hadn't been there. So even a technically correct call in the final minute landed like confirmation of a pattern rather than a straightforward enforcement of the rules. This is the unavoidable consequence of a badly officiated game. Eventually, a call that might have been defensible on its own terms becomes indefensible in context. The referee crew made that situation for themselves. They created an environment in which even the calls they got right were going to be questioned, because the calls they got wrong had already cost the audience's trust. Late-game officiation demands a different level of precision, not because the rules change, they don't, but because there's no runway left for recovery. A marginal call in the second quarter might be overcome by 30 more minutes of basketball. A marginal call on the final possession ends the game with one team believing it was stolen from them. When the referee becomes part of the story at that moment, something has gone seriously wrong before that moment arrived.
So let's answer the question directly, because the footage actually allows for a specific answer, even if it doesn't allow for the most dramatic one. Rigged? No, not based on what's here. Rigged requires coordination, it requires instruction, it requires an intentional effort to predetermine an outcome. There is no verified information in this game's footage showing that officials were directed to target Indiana, protect a specific player, or manipulate the result. Making that claim without that evidence isn't criticism, it's a conspiracy theory. And attaching conspiracy theories to legitimate officiating complaints is one of the most effective ways to make sure the legitimate complaints never get addressed. But here's what is supported by the footage. The officiating in this game was inconsistent in ways that affected meaningful possessions. Clark appeared to make a clean defensive play and was penalized. Mitchell appeared to be fouled while airborne and was not protected. Boston was called for a travel at the worst possible moment in a game where earlier violations may not have been treated with the same urgency. The standard that should have been visible and predictable was not consistently applied. And when that inconsistency concentrated itself against one team in the final minutes of a competitive game, fans were not being irrational when they pushed back hard. Poor positioning, inconsistent judgment, missed contact in real time, these things can explain a badly officiated night without requiring anyone to have been corrupt. Referees are human beings processing fast, physical action from imperfect angles under enormous pressure. Mistakes happen. The problem is not that mistakes exist. The problem is what happens after they happen. Does the league acknowledge them? Does it hold officials accountable in any way that the public can see? Does it provide the kind of transparency that lets fans understand how decisive possessions were judged and what the correct call should have been? Right now, the WNBA's relationship with officiating accountability is not strong enough for the moment the league finds itself in. The product is growing. The audience is expanding rapidly, bringing in millions of new viewers who don't have 20 years of loyalty protecting the league in their minds. These new viewers are forming impressions right now. When the rules appear unpredictable, when contact that draws a whistle at one end gets waved off at the other, when the league's response to criticism is silence or vague defensiveness rather than honest assessment, those new viewers may simply conclude that the outcomes depend on something other than the basketball being played. And once that conclusion sets in, it is extraordinarily difficult to reverse. The path forward is actually not that complicated. It's just uncomfortable for leagues to commit to because it requires admitting error publicly and consistently. The WNBA should release detailed accounts of key possessions after contested games, not just for the final 2 minutes, for any high-leverage decision in the second half of a close contest. Explain which calls were correct, admit which ones were missed, identify whether officials were properly positioned, grade crews internally, and make it clear that performance standards carry real consequences. When a call was wrong, say it was wrong. Fans tolerate honest mistakes far better than institutional defensiveness.
What destroys confidence faster than anything else is the appearance that the league protects its officials from accountability while simultaneously fining players and coaches for criticizing those same officials publicly. That asymmetry doesn't just feel unfair, it communicates that the league values protecting its employees over earning its audience's trust. And for the fans and commentators bringing these complaints, keep the criticism focused on what the footage can actually support. Attack the ruling, challenge the mechanics, compare the specific plays, and ask the league to explain the difference. That is the entire case. That is the version of this argument that cannot be easily dismissed and cannot be redirected into a culture war. Just two plays, one standard, or the apparent absence of one. Now you have to decide. Was this simply a rough night, human error from officials navigating a fast, intense game without the benefit of slow-motion replay in real time? Or did the repeated inconsistency cross a threshold that demands formal investigation and real structural accountability from the league? The footage is there. The comparisons are there. The answer you come to probably says something not just about this game, but also about how much confidence you have in the institution supposed to be protecting it. Drop your answer in the comments. If you want more breakdowns like this, possession by possession, call by call, no narrative pushed in advance, hit the like button and subscribe. We're not done with this story.